Welcome to New Way Teaching Lessons. If you're new here, don't forget to click subscribe. We upload videos every single week. In this series, we'll talk about Algebra 1, specifically Semester 1. Let's get started. Okay, before we get started, it's very, very important that you guys go back to our first playlist, Standard 1, before watching this Standard 2 playlist. There's a lot of knowledge in there and understanding that you're going to need to know for this specific video. Okay, first we're going to go over the toolbox. And in the toolbox, it has all our important vocab, our equations, and anything else that we're going to need to solve the examples in the actual notes. So the first vocabulary word that we have is constant. And basically what a constant is, it's a number that is strictly on its own. So if I gave you guys something like 6x minus 5 equals 2, which is what we're going to see today, a constant would be the number that's by itself. And when I mean by itself or on its own, I mean that it does not have anything attached to it, aka a variable, which we'll talk about in a moment. So there are actually two constants here. I'm just going to identify one of them, and that's -5. And I'll kind of explain in a little bit why I'm solely identifying -5 and not +2. The next vocabulary word is variable. A variable is any letter in an equation. So again, if we have the same exact equation as above, my variable is going to be x. It does not always have to be x. Sometimes it'll be y, sometimes it'll be n. You guys will get to see that in our examples. The next vocabulary word is coefficient. Coefficient is a number in front of a variable. So basically exactly what you see, that 6x minus 5 equals 2. Our variable, as we stated before, was x. So the number in front of that variable is 6. So that is our coefficient of this two-step equation. The next thing I want you guys to really take from this video is whenever you're solving two-step equations, no matter what, you have to leave the variable to the last step. So keep that in the back of your mind, and I'll go ahead and explain that in example 1. Before I start with example 1, down in the description box below, I do have a free downloadable that is a worksheet that goes directly with this video. It also includes U-tries for you to do after the examples. So there's 4 examples and 4 U-tries on this worksheet, and the answer key. So feel free to go to the link and download that at any time. Okay, so our goal of these notes is to understand how to solve a two-step equation with variables on one side. So our first example is 3x plus 6 equals 9. I know from my toolbox that my variable of this equation is x, and I know that I have to get x by itself. I also know from the toolbox that I do have to leave the variable till the last step. So what that means that anything attached to the variable, I cannot touch at the beginning. So the number that's attached to the variable is 3. So I need to leave the 3 alone. So the only number that I can move is that +6 because I need to move everything away from the x. So I'm not going to move the 9 over to the left. I'm going to move everything away from the x, starting with that 6. So going back to inverse operations, again, if you did not watch playlist 1, make sure you watch that. If I have a +6, I know my inverse operation, or the opposite of it, is -6. So whenever you're trying to get it on the other side, you have to use the inverse operation. So when I subtract 6 to one side, I also have to subtract it to the other. That's how we balance the equation. Those two 6's will end up canceling out, and I'm going to go ahead and bring everything else down. And I have 3x equals 3. After this, now I can go ahead and get rid of that 3 in front of my variable x. And I know that the 3 and the x, because they're sitting right next to one another, that means multiplication. There's no addition, there's no subtraction, there's no division. So I have multiplication. So the inverse or opposite of multiplication is division. So I know that I'm going to have to divide both sides by 3. So whatever number is in front of that variable, in this situation it's a 3, I need to get rid of that. So that's the number I'm going to divide by in purple. And again, just like the 6's did above, those 3's will cancel out, and you're left with x equals +1. So example 2 is 5n plus 2 equals 37. So just like I said at the beginning, the variable is not always going to be x or y. N is a possibility, r is a possibility. You're going to see any letter can be a variable. So again, in this situation, I know that I have to leave the variable to the last step. So I'm going to go ahead and subtract that 2 to both sides because I cannot do anything with the 5 yet. So as we look, the 2's are going to cancel out. So again, that tip, cross out numbers as we move them across the equal sign. If you cross out the numbers, I'm telling you, it'll make things much easier and much more organized. You'll know what you have left. I've seen a lot where students leave those 2's uncrossed and then end up bringing down a 4 or something like that. So make sure that you cross out those numbers like I did with the gray stripe. Going on, I have 5n equals 35. Again, that 5 and n are being held together by multiplication. So I'm going to go ahead and divide both sides, which is my inverse. I'm going to divide by 5. And again, if you can cross out, make sure you cross out so now I can see what I have left over. And 35 divided by 5 will give me 7 as my final answer. So example 3, I have a different example. I have some division going on, so it's a little different than the first two, but the steps in the process are the exact same thing. So I must leave the variable to the last step. So I'm not going to look at that 8 or that 3 that it's attached to. So my only number that I can move, you guessed it, it's that 6. So I need to subtract 6 to both sides. When I do that, again, make sure you're crossing things out, keeping your math organized, so that way you're less likely to make a mistake. Dropping that down, I'm going to have a divided by 3 equals -1. So now I'm in the same position. I have the variable at the last step. So now what do? I'm looking at how my variable is attached to that 3. And the way that it's attached is by a division bar or division sign. They're one and the same. So if I have a divided by 3, I'm going to go ahead and do the opposite. So the opposite of division is going to be multiplication. So looking at our tip, remember the inverse operations. Again, if you have not watched those videos, make sure you go back. So the opposite of division is going to be multiplication. I'm going to multiply both sides of the equation by +3. When I do that, the 3's on the left-hand side are going to, again, cancel out because the whole purpose of multiplying by 3 is to get rid of it, to have the a by itself because that's what I'm solving for. So now I have a equals -1 times 3, again, is -3. Okay, so our fourth example is similar to example 3, but now we're going to throw in some negatives. So again, I'm going back to what I know, and what I know is that I cannot touch the variable until the last step. So that 4 is included because that's attached to it. So all that leaves for me to do is subtract that 8 to both sides. When I do that, I'm going to subtract the 8 and cross it out. And notice, this is a big deal, guys. Make sure you bring down that negative that was in front of the b. So many times students get confused with negative and subtraction signs. They are one and the same, just like positive and addition signs are. So that subtraction sign is actually a negative sign and vice versa. So make sure you bring that down. The next step is, now that I have -b/4 equals -3, I do need to get the b by itself. So my first way to do that, just like the last question, is to get rid of whatever is attached to it. So first, I need to get rid of that 4. So if it's being held together by division, I'm going to go ahead and do the inverse, which is multiplying by 4. And just like the last question, those 4's will end up canceling out. And I'm left with -b equals -12. Again, notice how that negative is still there. So ask yourself, is the b by itself? Is our variable truly alone? And the answer to that is no, because there is a negative in front of it, which means there is a -1, which means even more that it's not by itself. So you got to continue. So if I'm looking at this question, I know that I have to still get the b alone. So if you look at our tip, remember the variable has to be all by itself. And in this situation, it's still not. So if I have -1 next to the b, that means multiplication. So I'm going to go ahead and do the inverse. The inverse of multiplication is, yep, you guessed it, division. So I'm going to divide both sides by -1. I'm going to cross out my -1s and end up with b equals +12, because a negative divided by a negative is in fact a positive. Thank you guys for watching, and don't forget to subscribe and like our channel. Make sure you give it a thumbs up and hit the notification bell to never miss a video. Have a good one.